You know that feeling when you're lying in bed at night and you think to yourself, tomorrow's gonna be different. Tomorrow, I'm finally gonna stick to that morning routine. I'm gonna hit the gym. I'm gonna eat better. I'm gonna be the person I know I can be. And then tomorrow comes and you hit snooze 3 times, skip the workout, and you're eating leftover pizza for breakfast while scrolling through your phone. Yeah, that's not a willpower problem. That's a neuroscience problem that nobody's actually explaining to you properly. My name's Dave, and I spend way too much time thinking about behavioral psychology and why humans do the absolute opposite of what they claim they want to do. If you're someone who's tried to build habits 17 different times, using 17 different apps and methods and motivational videos, and you still can't seem to make anything stick for longer than a week and a half, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing that drives me absolutely crazy. We've been fed this narrative about habit formation that's basically psychological garbage, and it's making everyone feel like failures when they're actually just following outdated advice. You've heard it all before, right? 21 days to form a habit. Just do it every day. Motivation is key. Create a streak and don't break it. Build willpower like a muscle. And my personal favorite, just want it badly enough. Look, I'm gonna be blunt with you. That's not how your brain works, like at all. A study published in the European Journal of Social Psychology in 2009 followed 96 people as they tried to form new habits. And the researchers found that on average, it took 66 days for a behavior to become automatic. But here's what most people don't realize about that study. The range was insane. For some people, it took 18 days. For others, it took 254 days. 254 days! That's more than 8 months of consistent daily practice. And you're beating yourself up because you couldn't make meditation stick in 3 weeks? The problem isn't you. The problem is that we've fundamentally misunderstood what a habit actually is at the neurological level and why your brain resists them so violently in the beginning. So let me explain what's actually happening inside your skull when you're trying to build a new habit, because this is where it gets really interesting. Your brain has this structure called the basal ganglia, which is basically the habit center of your brain. It's ancient, evolutionarily speaking. We're talking reptilian brain old. And its entire job is to automate behavior so that your prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, doesn't have to waste energy on every single decision you make throughout the day. Think about when you first learned to drive a car. You had to consciously think about every single movement. Check the mirror, signal, check the blind spot, ease off the brake, press the gas, turn the wheel, check the mirror again. It was exhausting, right? Your prefrontal cortex was working overtime. But now, if you've been driving for years, you can drive home from work while having a full conversation, eating a sandwich, and thinking about what you're gonna watch on Netflix later. That's your basal ganglia running a program. The behavior has been encoded into automatic neural pathways. But here's the catch, and this is what nobody tells you. Creating those automatic neural pathways requires an absolutely massive amount of energy, and your brain hates that. Your brain is incredibly stingy with energy. Even though your brain only makes up about 2% of your body weight, it uses roughly 20% of your body's total energy. So from an evolutionary perspective, your brain is constantly looking for ways to conserve energy, to run on autopilot, to not have to think about things. When you try to start a new habit, you're asking your brain to do something that goes against millions of years of evolutionary programming. You're asking it to spend extra energy building new neural pathways when it could just keep running the old pathways that already exist. And those old pathways, they're like 8-lane highways. They're smooth, they're fast, they're efficient. The new habit you're trying to build, that's a dirt path through the jungle that you have to machete your way through every single time. This is why it feels so hard in the beginning. It's supposed to feel hard. You're literally rewiring your brain. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Dave, that's interesting and all, but how does that help me actually stick to my habits? And that's exactly the right question, because understanding the neuroscience is only useful if it changes how you approach the problem. Most people try to build habits through what I call the brute force method. They rely entirely on motivation and willpower to power through until the habit becomes automatic. And look, I'm not gonna lie to you, some people can do this. Some people have the psychological resilience and the life circumstances to just grind through 66 or 100 or 200 days of forcing themselves to do something until it clicks. But for most people, this approach fails spectacularly. And here's why. Willpower is a limited resource. There's this concept in psychology called ego depletion, which was first proposed by researcher Roy Baumeister back in the 90s. The basic idea is that willpower works like a muscle, but not in the way people usually think. Yes, you can strengthen it over time, but in the moment, it gets fatigued with use. Baumeister did these fascinating experiments where he'd have people resist temptation in one task, like not eating freshly baked cookies that were sitting right in front of them, and then he'd give them a completely unrelated task that required willpower, like solving difficult puzzles. And consistently, the people who had to resist the cookies gave up on the puzzles much faster than the people who didn't have to resist temptation first. Their willpower had been depleted. Now, there's been some debate in recent years about whether ego depletion is as straightforward as Baumeister originally proposed, and some replication studies haven't found the same effects. But here's what we do know for absolute certain. Making decisions and resisting temptations takes mental energy. And by the end of a long day, when you've made hundreds of decisions and resisted dozens of temptations, you have way less mental energy available than you did in the morning. This is why you can resist the donuts at the morning meeting, but you cave and order takeout instead of cooking the healthy meal you planned for dinner. It's not a character flaw. Your willpower tank is empty. So if you're trying to build a new habit that requires willpower every single time you do it, you're setting yourself up for failure. Because there's gonna come a day, probably a Tuesday, because Tuesdays are statistically the worst, where you're stressed and tired and you've dealt with 17 different unexpected problems and your willpower tank is completely dry. And that's the day the streak breaks. That's the day you skip the gym or eat the junk food or don't do the thing you promised yourself you'd do. And then the guilt and shame spiral starts, and that's usually the end of the habit attempt. Here's what most people don't realize. Successful habit formation isn't about having more willpower. It's about designing your environment and your approach so that you need less willpower in the first place. Let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you want to start going to the gym in the morning before work. The traditional approach would be to set your alarm earlier, tell yourself you're going to do it, and then rely on willpower to actually get out of bed and go when the alarm goes off. And maybe that works for a few days, especially if you're feeling motivated. But eventually, you're going to have a night where you don't sleep well, or you're going to be stressed about a work presentation, or you're just going to be really comfortable in your bed and the willpower isn't going to be there. The environmental design approach looks completely different. You put your gym clothes on the floor next to your bed the night before, so they're literally the first thing you see when you wake up. You put your alarm across the room so you have to physically get out of bed to turn it off. You have a gym buddy who's meeting you there, so there's social accountability. You prep your gym bag and put it in your car the night before. You set up your coffee maker on a timer so there's fresh coffee ready when you wake up. You choose a gym that's on your route to work, not one that requires a special trip. Notice what's happening here? You're not trying to increase your willpower. You're systematically reducing the number of decisions you have to make and the amount of friction between you and the behavior you want to do. You're making the right choice, the easy choice. This is what psychologists call choice architecture, and it's incredibly powerful. A study published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine in 2012 looked at what happened when they simply changed where healthy and unhealthy foods were placed in a hospital cafeteria. They didn't remove any options. They didn't change the prices. They just moved the bottled water so it was next to every single drink station instead of just in one refrigerator. And they moved the healthier food options to eye level while putting less healthy options up higher or down lower. The result? Water sales increased by 11.4%. Unhealthy beverage sales decreased by 11.2%. Healthy food sales increased. Unhealthy food sales decreased. Same people, same choices available, different environment, massive behavior change. But here's where this gets even more interesting, and this is the part that completely changed how I think about habits. The environment matters, but so does your identity. And most people are going about this completely backwards. When most people try to build a habit, they're focused on the outcome they want. I want to lose 20 pounds. I want to write a book. I want to run a marathon. And they think that if they just do the behaviors associated with that outcome long enough, they'll get there. But what they're missing is the psychological mechanism that actually makes habits stick long term. There's this researcher named Dr. Benjamin Gardner at King's College London who studies habit formation. And his research shows something really counterintuitive. The strength of a habit isn't determined by how often you do it. It's determined by how automatic it feels and how much it becomes part of your identity. Think about someone who identifies as a runner versus someone who's just trying to run more. When it's raining and cold outside, the person who's just trying to run more thinks, do I have to run today? The person who identifies as a runner thinks, when am I running today? See the difference? One is a decision that requires willpower. The other is a given, a part of who they are. James Clear talks about this in his book Atomic Habits, and he's absolutely right. The most effective way to build a habit isn't to focus on what you want to achieve. It's to focus on who you want to become. You don't want to read more books. You want to become a reader. You don't want to go to the gym. You want to become an athletic person. You don't want to eat healthier. You want to become someone who values and respects their body. And here's the psychological shift that makes this work. Every time you do a behavior, you're casting a vote for the type of person you want to be. You're providing evidence to yourself about your identity. One workout doesn't make you an athletic person, but it's a vote for that identity. One healthy meal doesn't make you a healthy eater, but it's evidence that you're becoming one. And this is where the neuroscience and the psychology intersect in a really beautiful way. Remember how I said your brain is looking to conserve energy and run on autopilot? Well, one of the ways it does that is by creating a coherent sense of identity and then making decisions that align with that identity automatically. There's this concept in psychology called cognitive consistency theory, which basically says that humans have a deep psychological need to be consistent with their self-image. When there's a mismatch between who we think we are and what we do, it creates psychological discomfort called cognitive dissonance, and we're motivated to resolve that discomfort. Most people try to resolve it by changing their behavior back to match their old identity. Like, I'm not really a morning person, so of course I'm not going to keep waking up early. But if you can shift your identity first, even slightly, then cognitive consistency actually works in your favor. If you start to see yourself as someone who takes care of their health, then not going to the gym creates dissonance, and you're motivated to go to resolve that discomfort. This is why the first few repetitions of a new habit are so psychologically important. You're not just building neural pathways, you're building evidence for a new identity. And the more evidence you accumulate, the stronger that identity becomes, and the less willpower you need to act in accordance with it. But here's the thing that trips people up, and this is probably the biggest reason why habits don't stick. People expect linear progress, but habit formation is fundamentally non-linear. It doesn't work like you do the behavior for X number of days and then boom, it's automatic. It works in plateaus. There's this concept called the plateau of latent potential that Clear talks about, and it's based on real neuroscience about how learning happens in the brain. When you start a new habit, you're putting in effort every single day, but you don't see results. You don't feel different. The behavior doesn't feel any easier. You're in what's called the valley of disappointment, where you're doing the work, but you're not seeing the rewards. Most people quit here. They think it's not working, they think they're doing something wrong, they think they're broken, or they lack discipline, or whatever story they tell themselves. But what's actually happening is that your brain is building those neural pathways. It's just happening underneath the surface where you can't see it or feel it yet. And then, if you keep going, you hit a tipping point. Suddenly the behavior starts to feel easier. It starts to feel more automatic. You start seeing results. And it feels like it happened overnight, but it didn't. It happened because of all those days in the valley of disappointment where you were building the foundation. This is backed up by research on skill acquisition and motor learning. A study published in Nature Neuroscience in 2005 found that when people were learning a new motor sequence, most of the learning happened during rest periods, not during active practice. The brain was consolidating the new neural pathways during sleep and downtime, and then the next practice session would show improvement that seemed to come out of nowhere. The same thing happens with habits. You're doing the work, your brain is doing the work in the background, and then suddenly it clicks. But only if you stick with it through the valley. Now, let me tell you about something that absolutely blows my mind, and it's going to change how you think about building habits forever. Your brain has this thing called state-dependent learning, which means that what you learn and what behaviors you encode are tied to the physical and psychological state you're in when you encode them. Here's a wild example. There was a study done back in 1975 where researchers had scuba divers memorize lists of words either on land or underwater. And then they tested their recall either on land or underwater. And what they found was fascinating. The divers who learned the words underwater remembered them way better when they were tested underwater than when they were tested on land. And the divers who learned on land remembered them better on land than underwater. The environment and physical state they were in when they learned the information became part of the memory itself. And this applies to habits too. If you're trying to build a meditation habit and you only meditate when you're feeling calm and relaxed and motivated, then meditation becomes associated with that state. And on the days when you're stressed and anxious and overwhelmed, which are probably the days you need meditation the most, it's not going to feel natural or automatic because you haven't encoded it in that state. This is why it's actually important to practice your new habit in different states and contexts, especially in the beginning. You want to meditate when you're calm, yes, but also when you're stressed. You want to go to the gym when you're energized, but also when you're tired. Because you're teaching your brain that this behavior happens regardless of state, not because of a particular state. And here's another thing that nobody talks about. Your habits are cued by context. There's this whole field of research on what's called implementation intentions, which was pioneered by psychologist Peter Gallwitzer in the 90s. The basic format is, when situation X arises, I will perform response Y. The research on this is absolutely overwhelming. A meta-analysis of 94 studies published in 2006 found that implementation intentions increase the likelihood of goal attainment by a huge margin. We're talking success rates going from like 30% to 70% in some studies, just by specifying when and where you'll do the behavior. Why does this work? Because you're creating a cue in your environment that triggers the behavior automatically, without you having to think about it or decide about it in the moment. Instead of, I'm going to exercise more, it's when I wake up and my alarm goes off, I will put on my workout clothes and go to the gym. The alarm becomes the cue. The context becomes the trigger. And what's happening neurologically is that you're building an association between the cue and the behavior. You're creating what's called a habit loop. Cue, routine, reward. And the more times you complete that loop, the stronger the association becomes, until eventually the cue automatically triggers the behavior without conscious decision making. This is why people say things like, I don't feel like myself if I don't have my morning coffee, or I can't fall asleep without reading first. The behavior has become so tightly coupled to the form, context, and so integrated into their identity that not doing it feels wrong. But here's what's sneaky about this. It works both ways. If you're trying to build a new habit in a context where you have old habits, you're fighting against existing associations. This is why it's so hard to change your eating habits when you're still buying the same groceries and cooking in the same kitchen and eating in front of the same TV. All of those cues are triggering the old habits automatically. Research on addiction recovery has shown this really clearly. A study published in Science back in 1993 looked at heroin users who were addicted in Vietnam during the war. When they came back to the United States, about 95% of them quit using heroin without any formal treatment. 95%. That's insane compared to typical addiction recovery rates. Why? Because they completely changed their environment. All of the cues that were triggering their drug use, The people, the places, the stress of combat were gone. They were in a completely new context, so the old habit loops didn't activate. Now, I'm not saying you need to move to a new city to build new habits, although, honestly, that would probably work. But I am saying that if you're trying to build a new habit, you need to be really strategic about your environment. Either change the context where you do the behavior, or modify your existing environment to remove cues for old habits and create cues for new ones. Let me give you something practical here. If you want to stop scrolling through social media before bed and start reading instead, you can't just rely on willpower to choose the book over your phone. You need to change the environment. Put your phone in another room, plugged in charging, put a book on your pillow so it's literally the first thing you see when you get into bed. Make the right choice, the easy choice, and the wrong choice harder. And here's something else that's gonna sound weird, but is backed by solid research. You need to celebrate the behavior, not the outcome. Dr. BJ Fogg at Stanford runs the Behavior Design Lab, and he spent decades studying how behavior change actually works. And one of his key findings is what he calls the celebration effect. When you do a new behavior, even if it's tiny, and you immediately celebrate it, you create a positive emotional spike. And that positive emotion gets encoded along with the behavior in your brain. This is pure neuroscience. Your brain releases dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter, and dopamine is also the learning neurotransmitter. It's what tells your brain, this is important, remember this, do this again. So when you celebrate a behavior, you're literally training your brain to want to do that behavior again. But most people do the opposite. They accomplish the behavior and immediately move on, or worse, criticize themselves because they didn't do it perfectly, or they didn't do it earlier in the day, or whatever. So there's no positive emotional spike, no dopamine, no reinforcement. And the brain learns that this behavior is neutral at best or negative at worst, so why would it want to do it again? Fogg recommends doing a tiny celebration immediately after the behavior. A fist pump, saying nice out loud, doing a little dance, whatever feels natural to you. And it feels ridiculous, I know, but it works because you're hacking the neurochemical system that your brain uses to decide what behaviors to repeat. And speaking of neurochemistry, we need to talk about dopamine more broadly, because this is where a lot of modern habit advice completely falls apart. Your brain has what's called the dopamine reward system, and it's designed to motivate you to do things that are good for your survival. Food, sex, social connection, these all trigger dopamine release, which makes you feel good, which makes you want to do them again. It's a brilliant evolutionary system, but here's the problem. In the modern world, we've created all these supernormal stimuli that hijack this system. Social media, video games, junk food, pornography. These are all designed, either intentionally or accidentally, to trigger massive dopamine spikes that are way bigger than anything your brain evolved to handle. And when you're getting huge dopamine hits from scrolling through Instagram or eating potato chips or playing video games, the small dopamine release from doing something actually good for you, like exercising or reading or meditating, feels boring by comparison. Your brain becomes desensitized to normal levels of dopamine, and you need bigger and bigger hits to feel good. There's research showing that dopamine receptors actually downregulate when they're overstimulated. Your brain literally reduces the number of receptors to protect itself from the overload, which means you need more of the stimulus to get the same effect, which is, the definition of addiction. This is why people say things like, I know I should read, but I just can't focus, or I want to exercise, but I don't feel motivated. It's not a discipline problem. It's that your dopamine system is so overstimulated by high-intensity digital stimuli that normal, healthy behaviors can't compete. So if you're trying to build new habits and you're constantly scrolling social media and watching YouTube and playing games and eating highly processed foods, you're making it neurologically harder for yourself. You're trying to build healthy habits with a reward system that's been completely hijacked. And the solution isn't to white knuckle it and try to force yourself to find healthy behaviors rewarding. The solution is to do what's called a dopamine detox, where you intentionally reduce your exposure to supernormal stimuli for a period of time so your dopamine system can reset and recalibrate. This doesn't mean you have to live like a monk forever. But it does mean that when you're in the early stages of building a new habit, you should be really careful about competing sources of dopamine. Maybe don't start a meditation practice the same week you start playing a new video game. Maybe don't try to build a reading habit while you're also binge watching a new Netflix series. Give your brain a chance to find the new behavior rewarding without competition from nuclear levels of dopamine from digital sources. Now, let's talk about something that's going to make some people uncomfortable: the role of identity in habit failure. Most people, when they fail to stick to a habit, blame external circumstances or willpower or motivation. But a lot of the time, there's a deeper psychological thing happening. The habit you're trying to build is in conflict with your core identity, and your subconscious is sabotaging you to maintain identity coherence. Here's an example. Let's say you grew up in a family where nobody exercised, where being active wasn't valued, where maybe there was even subtle or overt messaging that people who cared a lot about fitness were vain or superficial. And now, as an adult, you consciously want to build an exercise habit. You know it's good for you. You want to be healthy. But deep in your subconscious, there's this belief that exercising a lot isn't who people like you are. And every time you start to succeed at building the habit, your subconscious freaks out because you're becoming someone who doesn't match your core identity. So it finds ways to sabotage you. You get injured. You get too busy. You lose motivation. Something always comes up. This is called an upper limit problem, a concept from psychologist Gay Hendricks. The idea is that we all have unconscious limits on how much success or happiness or health we're allowed to have based on our core beliefs about ourselves. And when we start to exceed those limits, we unconsciously sabotage ourselves to bring us back down to our comfort zone. And habit formation is one of the most common places this shows up. Because successfully building a new habit often requires becoming a different version of yourself. And that can be psychologically threatening if it conflicts with your identity. The solution is to do identity work alongside habit work. You need to examine your beliefs about who you are and who you're allowed to become. You need to consciously update your identity to include this new version of yourself. And you need to look for the psychological payoffs you're getting from not changing. Because I promise you, there are some. Maybe not exercising means you don't have to face your insecurities about your body. Maybe not building a writing practice means you don't have to risk failure or judgment. Maybe staying disorganized means you have an excuse for not achieving more. I'm not saying these are good reasons. I'm saying they're real psychological mechanisms that your brain is using to protect you from perceived threats. And until you address those underlying psychological factors, you're going to keep struggling with surface level behavior change. Here's another thing that's absolutely critical and almost nobody talks about. The people around you have a massive influence on your ability to build and maintain habits. There's this famous study by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2007 that looked at obesity in social networks. They tracked over 12,000 people over 32 years, and what they found was shocking. If your friend becomes obese, your risk of becoming obese increases by 57%. If it's a close mutual friend, it increases by 171%. Your friend's friend, someone you don't even know, if they become obese, your risk increases by 20%. Think about that. Your friend's friend's weight gain affects your weight. That's 3 degrees of separation. And this wasn't about living together or sharing meals. These were people spread across the country. It was purely about social norms and what's acceptable and normal in your social network. The same effect has been found for smoking, drinking, happiness, even cooperation and generosity. Your behavior is massively influenced by the people around you, even people you don't directly interact with. So if you're trying to build a habit that nobody in your social circle has, you're fighting against social norms. Your brain is wired to conform, to fit in, because evolutionarily, being accepted by your tribe was literally a matter of life and death. Getting kicked out of the tribe meant you died. So we have deep psychological drives to match the behavior of the people around us. This is why it's so much easier to build habits when you join a community of people who already have those habits. If you want to run, join a running club. If you want to read more, join a book club. If you want to eat healthier, surround yourself with people who value nutrition. You're not just getting accountability and support, which are nice. You're shifting your social norms so that the behavior you want becomes the default in your environment. And if you can't change your social circle, at least be aware of this dynamic. Know that you're gonna face social pressure, sometimes subtle, to conform to the habits and behaviors of the people around you, and develop strategies to resist that pressure, whether it's finding online communities, working with a coach, or just being really intentional about protecting your new habits from social sabotage. All right, here's something practical you can use right now: the 2-minute rule. This comes from David Allen's Getting Things Done methodology, but it applies perfectly to habit formation. The idea is that when you're starting a new habit, you scale it down to something that takes 2 minutes or less. Not 2 minutes as a warm-up to the real habit. 2 minutes is the habit. Want to start a reading habit? Your habit is to read 1 page. Want to start exercising? Your habit is to put on your workout clothes. Want to start meditating? Your habit is to sit on your meditation cushion and take 3 breaths. And this feels stupidly simple, right? Like, what's the point of reading 1 page or doing 3 breaths? But here's what's actually happening. You're removing all friction and all excuses. You can't say you don't have time to read 1 page. You can't say you're too tired to put on workout clothes. There's no barrier. And what you're doing is training your brain that this is something you do. You're building the identity and the automaticity without requiring results or progress. You're casting votes for the type of person you want to be. And here's the magical thing. Once you've read 1 page, you'll usually keep reading. Once you've put on workout clothes, you'll usually work out. Once you've sat down and taken 3 breaths, you'll usually keep meditating, because the hardest part is starting, and you've already done that. But even if you don't, even if you literally just read 1 page and stop, you've still succeeded. You've still done the habit. You've still reinforced the identity and built the neural pathway. And that's way more valuable in the long run than doing a huge workout one day and then burning out and doing nothing for a week. This is about building consistency, not intensity. And consistency is what creates automaticity. Now let's talk about what to do when you inevitably miss a day. Because you will. Life happens. You get sick. You travel. You have a crisis. Something comes up and you break your streak. Most people, when this happens, spiral. They think, well, I've already failed. What's the point? And they give up entirely. Or they beat themselves up with guilt and shame, which creates negative associations with the habit and makes it harder to start again. Here's what you need to understand. Missing 1 day doesn't matter. Missing 2 days in a row is the problem. There's research on this from Philippa Lally at University College London, the same researcher who did the study on how long habits take to form. She found that missing a single day had almost no impact on the automaticity of the habit. The neural pathway doesn't degrade that fast, but missing multiple days in a row does start to weaken the association. So the rule is simple: never miss twice. If you miss Monday's workout, you absolutely cannot miss Tuesday. If you skip your morning meditation, you cannot skip the evening one. 1 miss is an exception. 2 misses is the start of a new pattern. And your brain is really good at forming patterns. This takes all the guilt and shame out of it. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to never miss twice. And that's way more psychologically manageable. All right, let's bring this all together because I know I've thrown a lot at you. Here's the actual framework for building habits that stick based on everything we've talked about. First, forget outcomes. Focus on identity. Who do you want to become? Not what do you want to achieve, but who do you want to be? A reader, an athlete, a creative. Get clear on that identity because that's what's actually going to sustain the behavior long term. Second, design your environment for success. Remove cues for bad habits. Create cues for good habits. Make the right choice the easy choice. Don't rely on willpower when you can change your context. Third, start stupidly small. 2 minutes or less. Build the consistency and the identity first. You can scale up later once the behavior is automatic. Fourth, use implementation intentions. Decide exactly when and where you'll do the behavior. When X happens, I will do Y. Take the decision out of the moment. Fifth, celebrate immediately. Create a positive emotional spike right after you do the behavior so your brain releases dopamine and wants to do it again. Sixth, never miss twice. One miss is fine, two misses is a pattern. Get back on track immediately. Seventh, be patient through the valley of disappointment. Understand that results lag behind effort. You're building neural pathways that you can't see yet. Trust the process. And eighth, address the psychology underneath. Look at your beliefs about yourself. Look at your social circle. Look at the psychological payoffs you might be getting from not changing. Do the deeper work. Look, here's the truth. Building habits that stick isn't about discipline or willpower or motivation. It's about understanding how your brain actually works and designing a system that works with your neuroscience, not against it. It's about making tiny, consistent changes to your identity and environment that compound over time into massive transformation. You're not broken, you're not lazy, you're not lacking in discipline. You've just been using strategies that don't match how behavior change actually works at the neurological level. And now you know better. So go build something that sticks.